Today is September 16th, 2022, and we're going to talk again. It's been 2 or 3 weeks since we talked last time, and this time I'm hoping to transition and start to get into, I want to learn more about Lucille and how you met her, why you guys decided to get married. Basically, your life with Lucille will hopefully be the next several Zoom calls. I assume it'll take more than one.
Okay. Following the funeral of Esther, I spent the funeral was in the week of January 20th, 1980. And on the day after the funeral was actually the first day that I realized I was by myself now. I had been by myself actually for about 3 or 4 weeks before Esther's passing. One night, my nights were quiet after work. I would go to work in the morning and come home at night. I was learning how to fend by myself. I had to learn to do some basic cooking, take care of the house, take care of myself, primarily because if I didn't take care of myself, nothing else could be taken care of. So one night, maybe 2.5 weeks after Lucille's funeral, I got a phone call, and I answered a phone call, and a voice said, "Can I talk to Esther?" And that hit me like a ton of bricks. Everybody that we knew was at Esther's funeral. I should have recognized the voice, but I didn't. And so I said, "Who is this?" And the voice on the other end said, "This is Bob." Well, Bob was Judy's divorced husband. I told him what had happened to Esther, and he apparently didn't know. And he said, "Oh," I don't remember what his comments were when I told him about what happened to Esther, but in any event, he hung up and I never heard from him again. Okay. The days and nights started falling into a routine, and one day, maybe 2.5 or 3 weeks after Esther's funeral, I was talking to a friend, I think a friend of Judy's, I'm not sure who she was, where the mother of this friend knew of a group that was being held at the Encino Hospital about recently about people who had lost their wives or their husbands, and it was a meeting to try to understand what had happened to us and how to cope with what inevitably followed. I forget what they call this kind of class now, a bereavement class, I believe. And it was held every other Tuesday. So this, I believe, was the third Tuesday in February of 1980. On that Tuesday, I drove to Encino Hospital, found a place to park, and after inquiring about the location of where this meeting was being held, I walked into the room. There might have been 30 to 40 people in the room at the time I walked in. It was just about start time for it. Most of the people were standing up near the front of the room, and most of the people were women. There might have been 5, 6, 7 men there. I'm not sure. And there were about 6 rows of chairs there, in 2 aisles and 3 groups of seats. In the center, there was roughly 5 or 6 seats, and there was an aisle on each side, and on each other side of the aisle, there was 2 or 3 more seats. So roughly about 40 or 50 seats altogether in the 5 or 6 rows, or how many they were. I was debating about what was going to happen there. I didn't feel comfortable. I'm not sure what I did. I have an impression that I walked back to the car and got in it and then got out of it and went back again, but I'm not sure what happened. So I just, but I apparently, if I didn't leave, I went back because I remember the meeting. We had a coordinator who ran it, and when the meeting was called to order, this person, I don't even remember if it was male or female, told us how it would run. In some ways, it ran like Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or something like that. The meeting was called to order, and our facilitator told us how it would work. We would meet twice a month. The number of meetings to be held was to be determined, and there was other conversations. Several people would throw questions at him while the meeting was going on, and he diverted these questions very, very, very cleverly. We'll find out about that later. And while he was talking, I was sitting in an aisle seat, roughly in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th row, the last row. I'm not sure whether there was anybody sitting to my right or not. I was on aisle seat on the left side. There was another aisle on the right side, about 4, 5, or 6 seats away. But I became aware of somebody standing next to me, maybe 5, 6 minutes after the meeting had started. Our facilitator looked up, and I heard a voice say, "My name is Lucille Zalon, and I want to apologize for being late. I got here as fast as I could." And I looked up to see this lady standing there. She was dressed in a beige skirt and matching jacket. I don't know what kind of blouse she had on. She had rose tinted glasses, curly hair, and that was my first impression of Lucille. The facilitator asked her to take a seat and to continue. Most of the seats in front were filled up, mostly women, a few men. And then she looked to her left to see 3 empty seats. The seats that were on the wall side of the aisles were mostly unoccupied. Again, I don't know whether anybody was sitting to my right. There was about 4 or 5 seats to my right towards the other aisle. And as I remember it, she looked at me. I'm not sure whether she smiled, and I let her pass, and she took a seat, maybe 2 or 3 seats away from me on my right. And so that was my first meeting with Lucille. The meeting continued. I don't know what would happen. Many of the people there, when the facilitator asked for any questions, all the hands went up. Everybody had questions. I'm not sure what my reaction was to it at the time. In any event, these meetings again went on every other Tuesday and through the remainder of February, March, April, and I think it went into the spring. As the meetings went on and we all became acquainted with each other, which is the best way I can put it, of the 4 or 5 men that were there, a couple dropped out. There was also some women that dropped out, so that every week there were less people there. Then one day, one meeting, maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 meetings into our sessions, what would happen is our facilitator would lecture to us how we were to continue with our lives, that we couldn't let the loss of a mate mean the loss of our lives too. And so that's basically what it was. I presume that's how Alcoholic Anonymous people would tell how alcohol would affect their lives. Well, we learned how the loss of a mate would affect us. Going back to the meetings again, at one meeting, Lucille approached me with a problem she had. Well, let me go back to the first or the second meeting. One of the things that happens at a meeting like this, the facilitator calls on everybody to stand up and identify themselves and give a brief history of their life, what their work was, a little bit about their families, just again, a brief history of their life. And so my turn came and I told them all about myself. So they we all had a kind of like a coloring introduction to each other. We knew everybody's name by now, and a little bit of their background. Again, Lucille approached me, and she had 2 cars. What had happened is her late husband had leukemia. He passed from leukemia, and he knew what his fate was going to be. So he apparently had spent a lot of time with her on how to live by herself. He bought her a new car so she wouldn't have to worry about transportation or getting an older car fixed. He set up their financial situation where she would not have to run through bank accounts or anything. Anyway, her late husband set her up fine, that all she had to do in the morning was just get up and live. In the meantime, she had 2 cars. The one that the new car he had bought hers, and there was another car that apparently had been his. I'll take that back. There were she had 3 cars. The one that he had bought her, there was a Datsun sedan that had been their car, and her husband had a British car. It wasn't an MG, it was one step up above an MG. I don't remember the make. Anyway, she asked me how would I sell it, and some things needed fixing on it, etc., etc. And so that's how I met Lucille. She gave me her address. I went over to her house, and I looked at the British car. Now, I knew a tiny bit about British sports cars because both Judy and Mark had MGBs, I believe. The MGA was an MG Roadster. The MGB was a 2-door fastback. And this car looked like that, except it wasn't an MG. I don't remember what the make of it was. And anyway, looking at the car, the problem was something to do with the brake master cylinder that needed fixing. Well, I took on the burden of fixing it, and I'm not sure what I did. I think I found a repair kit for the brake master cylinder, and I fixed it, got it going again. But I told her if the master cylinder was bad, that there would be other problems in the brake system. Suggested that she sell the car, which she did, and we became friends. That's the best way. Yes, we became friends.
Well, in the beginning, was it? I mean, was there a spark there, or was it just friends at the beginning, like genuinely friends, and then that spark happened later?
With me, the spark was already there. She never expressed what she thought of me when she first first met me, but obviously she didn't turn me away. Anyway, that was the start of a relationship. The meetings at the hospital ended sometime in the late spring of 1980, and our friendship continued towards the summer. In early summer, I believe June of 1980, she told me about her brother. His name was David Berman, but everybody called him Doo-Doo. I never could figure out. To me, Doo-Doo was what what your pets did, what they soiled in the inside. But that was his name, and I was to meet him later that year or early the following year. Anyway, her brother and his her sister-in-law had been on a tour of the Near East. They had been in Israel for an extended length of time, and she was to meet them in Israel, and they were going to do some more touring there, and then they end up, I guess, in Italy before coming back to the States. Anyway, on the day she left to go to Israel, I had said goodbye to her the day before. This apparently was on a weekend because it was not a work day. And on the morning she was to depart, we'd already said goodbye. For whatever reason, I decided to go down and see her depart. She was departing on the TWA, so I went out. I bought a bouquet of flowers and drove down to the airport, and I knew she was leaving from TWA, so that's where I went. I saw the flight number and everything, but I couldn't see Lucille. So I'm walking around there with a bouquet of flowers in my hand, and apparently I got the interest of some of the people there. Somebody asked me, "Are you looking for somebody?" And I said, "Yes, I have a friend that's departing today, but I don't see her." And we looked around, and she said, "Well, maybe she's in the VIP room." And she said, "What's her name again?" And I told him, and he went in the room, and a minute or two later, he came out, and Lucille was with him. And she was surprised I was there. I gave her the flowers, and obviously everybody around there do. I think even some people clapped. That's my memory. I don't know why. And now, so we talked for a few minutes, and then it became time to board. And as she left, she said she was going to be gone for about 6 weeks. And she asked me, something's been on my mind, that could you possibly pick me up when I come back? And she gave me the date she's going to come back and the flight she's going to come back on. And that was in the very late afternoon of a weekday a weekday, 6 days in advance. Actually speaking, it was very convenient for me because I was working for Alfred and Alfred Scrapyard then, and we got off work at 5:30 or at 5 o'clock, and we drove back the 405, which went right past the airport. She she was arriving about the time we got off work, actually. So on the day she returned, I made sure I was driving because I used to alternate with Bernie and going and coming to work. He'd drive one day, I drove the next. I don't remember what the situation was picking her up, but I did pick her up. We went home. We dropped off Bernie, and then I took her home, and that somehow cemented our relationship, and we couldn't go on from there. Any questions?
That's a great story. I didn't know about that. So, so then at this point, yeah, I really like that. So at this point, did most of the family know about Lucille?
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah,
everyone was
yeah.
kind of aware that
Because
you
when
were.
she, I think she went to Israel in late May or early June and came back in the middle of July, which was middle of the summer. By this time, everybody knew about our relationship, and our relationship continued. And then in the winter and spring of 1981, we decided to go on a vacation together. I took our first vacation, which was taking the trip in Canada from Vancouver to Toronto by rail, and stopping at all the various Canadian national parks, etc. So that was our first vacation together.
So I actually want to talk about some of these vacations. Well, because I
Okay.
know you guys did a lot of basically did a lot of big vacations with Lucille. Was she the one?
Year.
Was she
Yeah.
the one that thought of these the vacations and stuff? Was she the?
It was her idea. It was her idea. That it never would occurred to me, but yeah, places she wanted to see and places I wanted to see too. It was we went to. We actually flew to Vancouver. This was in the spring of 1981. Now, what had happened in earlier, there was a big volcanic eruption in, I believe in Oregon, Mount St. Helena, something like that.
St. Helens in southern Washington, and it's St.
Southern
Helens.
Washington. Yeah. Okay. It was quite an eruption. Destroyed a lot of forest and unfortunately took a number of lives too. But in any event, by the time we were to go on this rail trip, the eruption was over and things had quieted down. And I remember as we flew over on our way to Vancouver, everybody was trying to get a window seat to look down. We can look down on the volcano. We viewed it from roughly 30,000 some odd feet. That was almost the main thing about the trip. And so we landed in Vancouver. We spent a couple days up there. We went on a cable car up to the top of some mountain. We took various tours around Vancouver, and then got on the train and stopped at the various national parks. There one big one, I don't recall the name of it. We spent 2 days at a park there, and ended up in Toronto. We took a excuse me. We took a bus from Toronto to Quebec, and we stayed in Quebec a few days, and then we rented a car. Now, something I passed on, I probably should have mentioned at the start, that Lucille had a nephew. I remember I mentioned Doodle, her brother. Well, one of his sons, who was it, Michael, was getting married in Philadelphia. Okay, this was what, 40 some odd years ago, and it's a little vague to me. In any event, we rented a car. We drove from Quebec to Philadelphia. There was a wedding there we attended, and then after Philadelphia, Lucille had relatives or close friends in New York. We drove to New York. I had a rental car, which was cost me at the time, I think $7 or $8 a day rental. And when we got to New York, met our friends there. We stayed there for a few days. I don't remember how long, but I remember I was paying more to park the car in a garage in New York than I was paying for the rental. We stayed in New York for a few days. I missed, what did I missed something. Oh, okay, I missed something. And we drove into Philadelphia first for the wedding. But what happened, driving into Philadelphia on one of their freeways, major freeways, had a rental car. All of a sudden, the engine stopped. Just driving along fine, and no sputters, no putts, spits, or anything like that. The engine just stopped, and I pulled off to the side. Okay, it was a problem because we didn't carry phones with us then, but somebody stopped, and eventually a wrecker showed up. I don't know the name of the rental firm that we rented the car in, but it was a major firm there. So the wrecker towed the car to one of their local offices. Now, remember, this is a Canadian car. And we had all kinds of problems about where the car, who owned the car, where did it belong? Eventually, we got that straightened out. We got a replacement car at this place here, and we continued on to our journey after maybe 3 or 4 hours of being hassled around a little bit, trying to exchange a Canadian car with an American car. Eventually, the wedding was over. We went to New York, stayed there for a few days, and we drove back to Quebec. We got back to Quebec the next day. It was time to return. So when we made arrangements for the trip, as I remember, we could not get a direct flight from Quebec to Los Angeles. The best we could do was from Toronto to Los Angeles. So in any event, we took a flight from Quebec to Toronto, and for Toronto, we got on a plane for Los Angeles. Something happened to the airplane there because we didn't depart right away. There was something wrong with the airplane that they were fixing. They had loaded the plane. We're ready to roll it out of its berth there. It's not a berth, I forget. The station where the plane is, I can't think of what they call them now. But we didn't. We stayed there for 1 hour passed, 2 hours passed, 3 hours passed. The plane wasn't fixed. By this time, it's late in the afternoon, and they decided to feed us. It was dinner time. Now, all of a sudden, we became the responsibility of the airline because our departure date had passed. And so we deboarded the plane, and they brought in fast food from a national chain. I don't remember what the name of the national chain was. I probably would remember if I heard the name, but that's okay. So they brought in a lot of food for us. Now, there probably was a pretty close to 200 passengers, I would guess, on this flight. That was a direct flight from Toronto to Los Angeles. The rest of the day there is somewhat vague, but I do remember we departed over after maybe a 5-hour delay. In any event, eventually we boarded again, and this time I believe it was another airplane. I'm not sure, and we returned to Los Angeles. So that was our first trip together.
That was not a small trip either.
No. Aside from the airplane problem and the car problem, things went well. I met a lot of new friends. I met Lucille's family. Apparently, I met their approval, and we went on from there.
Did you generally get along with her family and friends?
Oh yeah, because Lucille is a very friendly person. Her family was friendly. And all the time we visited them. This was in the wedding and the trip was in 1981. We went back there, and a few years later, I don't remember what for, so again, all vague to me, but they greeted me like family, and and all as I became acquainted with, with Lucille's friends, and this was an academic rich family. Everybody had a college education. Quite a number of them had advanced degrees in this and that. Her friends became my friends. At no time did anybody ever ask me about my education history or if I had a degree, because aside from going to the University of Missouri when I was in the Navy, and the attended a lot of classes at Pierce College after I got out. That's as close as I came to academia. And none of her friends ever asked me about my educational history. They just accepted me for what I was. And I privately appreciated that.
Well, you don't need a college degree. You're very
I
intelligent.
didn't need
So,
a degree to be a part of her family.
so let's see. I don't know where to go from here. This is I don't know much about like the early
Okay,
1980s and kind of what else.
okay. And our relationship grew together. Sometime in 1982, I asked her to marry me. And she said no. I never asked her why, but apparently there was a connection with her late husband and her late husband's family and her own family that somehow prevented her from accepting me as her husband. Anyway, this went on actually for 10 years. I met her early in 1980, and eventually it occurred to her that we better get married because people were wondering. In any event, we got married on March 18th of 2090, 10 years after we met.
It was 1990?
1990. Then after we got married at the house, you were there yourself, Ryan.
Yes, I have. Some.
You were
minimal memories of that period.
You were 10 or 11 years old.
I want to say I was younger, but yeah, I could have been 10 or 11.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, let's back up. We just jumped a whole decade, so I don't want to I don't want to quite jump all the way to you guys getting married yet.
Okay.
So I want to hear more about kind of your during this period. So okay. I'll first ask.
Things happened during this period. One of the things that happened was I decided to sell my house. Let's see what happened I moved out of my house on my birthday, August 16th, 1986, and moved in with Lucille. What happened between 1982 and 1986? Okay. I was being acclimated more into Lucille's family, and she likewise into my family, where I went, she went, where she went, I went, etc. We went on vacations once a year. One vacation we went on to was to Hawaii in 1982, I think, or 83. And then we started taking these trips once a year called Rhode Scholar, in which we would go to a college where we would pursue a particular subject for a week. We went to Catalina Island. We went back to Canada. We went to colleges all over the country, Rhode Scholar. This went on for 16 or 17 years.
Wow.
We even took a trip to Europe. We took 2 trips to Europe. One of them was on a trip to the Netherlands, Holland, where we rode a bike across Holland for 249 miles in 9 days. Went to Britain. We went to one in Italy.
Well, I want to hear more details on some of these, and we can't do them all right now. So I'll go back to the these scholar trips. So what types of courses would you take when you were doing these?
You name it, we took it.
Would you take the same course, you and Lucille?
Well, the whole trip was the same. Everybody that attended had the same course.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if you had if you could choose
No, we took one to Catalina, and that was mostly a marine study. The University of Southern California had a little settlement on the northern part of the island where a lot of diving took place, and they even had one of these chambers where you get in to get rid of the bends where they whatever it is. It's very, very, very vague to me. But we went through a minor thing with what people go through. So we learned all about the marine environment, about Catalina Island. We go to various subjects. One had to do with the military. You name the subject, because we had 16 or 17 Rhode Scholar trips. Took one a year, and very enlightening.
It sounds like it. It's nice to get away and go to someplace else to do that.
We went to Wyoming for one, learned all about the how the West was won. You name the subject, we almost had it. We went to the island of Kauai once. We were actually to Kauai maybe 2 or 3 times following that. Oh, let's see. And then there were Lucille's friends. Remember, I told you about her when she went to Israel to meet her brother and father trip, and she was in the VIP room. Well, she had some friends. They were of Japanese descent. Their names were Tumeras, and they lived in Studio City in the hills above Ventura Boulevard going through there. So I don't remember exactly where it is. They had a little house that led off to their own. To get it, you had to go through a private driveway. There wasn't much parking up atop. I always hated to drive up there, but anyway, the Tumeras were her fast friends, and John Tumera was an engineer, and he worked for the people that what was the name of the company that started microwaves in Woodland Hills. They had a small, and I can't think of the name of the company. He was a big wheel with that company, and he had become a friend of Lucille's husband. Just to go back a little bit, Lucille and her husband were from Chicago. They were both born and raised in Chicago. They got married in, I think, 1948 after the war, and her husband was an engineer that was recruited by Lockheed in 1947 or 48.
What was his name?
This was in the Cold War era. It started then.
What was Lucille's original husband's name? What was his name?
Zalon.
No, his first name.
Albert.
Albert. Okay, it slipped my mind.
Yeah, they called him Al, he came out here. He was a specialist in infrared technology, and apparently he was involved in a lot of the infrared technology that was just it was new at the time. He came out here recruited by, first he was recruited to Minneapolis by the Honeywell company. And then they moved to into Indianapolis, Minnesota. When that work petered out, he was recruited again by Lockheed. So they came out here to Los Angeles. And then when that petered out, he went to work for Hughes Aircraft. And he worked for Hughes until he passed away. I think from a blood disease, I think leukemia. And so that when they came out here, they had bought a small house in Woodland Hills, just off of Victory Boulevard, just south of Victory Boulevard, and east of Pierce College. East of Pierce College, somewhere in that area. Then they bought their to be their home for a long time on I can't think that I lived there for almost 40 years. Algunas Road, yeah, that, and that's where they lived. That's where Lucille lived for the rest of her life. Where was I?
You had sidetracked. You were talking about John Tunis or something.
Okay, I'm
Tumera.
talking about. Okay, now what have John Tumera and his family? They had met well, working together at in Minnesota for the Honeywell company. And John worked for a company that made a commercial success of microwave ovens. I can't think of the company. They were a big thing in the space industry, though. They had a large facility off of Canoga and Burbank Boulevard. They're a big facility. I can't think of the name of it. Okay. Anyway, the Tumeras and the Zalons were very close friends for years to come. And what had happened, all these people had something that was called a discussion group. And they would meet once a month at somebody's house. And at the time, there were 14, 15, 16, maybe more people. I can't recall their names now, but we once a month, it was on Tuesdays, the second or third Tuesday of every month, we would go to the house of one of these people, serve, we wouldn't go for dinner, but there were always hors d'oeuvres and other snacks served. And we would sit for 3 or 4 hours talking about the latest subjects. And I didn't need to be taught that for the next few years, go into these meetings once a month. I just kept my mouth shut and my ears open. And I learned a lot about world events, what was going on with a lot of things. As the years went by, since these people were all contemporaries of ours, one by one, they got sick and passed away until there was a time when we had our last meeting, and there was only a few of us left. Questions?
No, it's that sounds nice. While I imagine for that sounds nice
Okay.
to have.
It's 10 o'clock.
Yeah, I think we'll call it a day. And I have actually a bit more questions. I want to hear more stories about trips and stuff, but we can let's come back to this, and I'll start peppering you more with life during the
Okay.
80s, because it kind of sounds pretty interesting. So, but we'll call it a day for now, and maybe next week we can get back to this.
Yeah.
Okay,
Give my best to the family.
I will do that.
Yeah. How did Jackson do on the hiking trip? Any problems?
Nope, he's a good hiker.
He's a good hiker.
He's a better hiker. He was in the lead with Darren and me and my dad, taking up the rear.
Okay, glad to hear that. All right.
Yeah, I'll shut this down and then we can talk.
Miss you, love you.
I love you too.
Bye.
Bye.